4. Walking, he reaches the border. A flock of vultures circle over something, probably a corpse. The muscles in his thighs respond to the irregularities of the path. The hills are shrouded in dry grass, stretching out east to the horizon. He has not eaten since the night before. He is no longer afraid. He wakes fully dressed, lying across his bed. A truck is unloading, a shipment outside the delivery entrance of Monoprix. It is a little after 7 o'clock. For years, Michel had lived a purely intellectual existence. The world of human emotions was not his field. He knows little about it. Nowadays, life can be organized with minute precision. Supermarket cashiers respond to an imperceptible nod. There has been much coming and going in the 10 years he has lived here. From time to time, a couple formed, and he watched as the new lover moved in. Friends carrying boxes and lamps up the stairs. They were young, and sometimes he heard them laugh. Often, but not always, when they split up, the ex-lovers moved out at the same time, leaving an empty apartment. What conclusions could he draw from such things? How should he interpret these comings and goings? It was puzzling. He himself wanted nothing more than to love. He asked for nothing in particular anyway. Life should be simple, Michel thought, something that could be lived as a collection of small, endlessly repeated rituals. Perhaps somewhat empty rituals, but they gave you something to believe in. A life without risk, without drama. But life was not like that. Sometimes he went out and watched the teenagers and the buildings. One thing seemed clear to him. No one knew how to live anymore. Perhaps that was an exaggeration. Some people seemed motivated, passionate about some cause, and their lives seemed to have more weight. Hence, ACT UP activists thought it was important to run ads, which others thought pornographic, depicting homosexual practices in close-up. Their lives seemed busier and more fulfilled, full of exciting incident. They had multiple partners, fucked each other in back rooms. Sometimes the condom split or slipped off, and they died of AIDS. Even then, their deaths seemed radical, dignified. Television gave lessons in dignity, especially TF1. As a teenager, Michel believed that suffering conferred dignity on a person. Now he had to admit he had been wrong. What conferred dignity on people was television. Despite the constant and pure pleasures of television, he thought it best to go out. In any case, he had to do his shopping. The only conclusion he could draw was that without points of reference, a man melts away. On the morning of 9th July, the feast of Sainte Amandine, he noticed that ring binders, exercise books, and pencil cases were already on display in Monoprix. He found the advertising slogan, "Back to school, no headaches," less than persuasive. What was education? What was knowledge, after all, if not one long headache? The following morning, he found the autumn-winter catalogue from 3 Suisse in his mailbox. The massive hardcover was not addressed. Had it been hand-delivered? As a long-standing subscriber to mail-order catalogues, he was used to the little extras that came with being a loyal customer. Time rolled on. Despite the glorious summer weather, marketing campaigns were already looking to the autumn, though July had barely begun. As a young man, Michel had read some absurdist literature, focusing on existentialist despair and on the motionless emptiness of days. He found such extremes of opinion only half convincing. At the time, he was seeing a lot of Bruno, who dreamed about becoming a writer, covering pages and pages with ink, and masturbating continually. He introduced Michel to Samuel Beckett. Presumably, He was what they called a great writer, though Michel had never managed to finish a single one of his books. That was in the late 1970s. He and Bruno were in their 20s and already felt old. As time went on, they would feel older still and be ashamed by the fact. Their generation was about to make a dramatic shift, substituting the tragedy of death with the more general humiliation of old age. 20 years later, Bruno had never seriously thought about death and was beginning to wonder if he ever would. He wanted to live to the end, to be a part of life, to fight against physical infirmity and petty everyday misfortunes. With his last breath, he would still plead for a postponement, to live a little longer. In particular, he would continue his quest for the ultimate pleasure to the end, one last indulgence. However transitory, a good blowjob was a real pleasure, and that, Michel thought as he flicked through the lingerie section, sensual garters of his catalogue, was something no one could deny. He himself masturbated rarely. His fantasies as a young research student, whether inspired by the Minitel or by actual women, usually reps from large pharmaceutical companies, had gradually faded. Now he calmly managed the slow decline of his virility by occasionally jerking off, for which his 3 Suisse catalogue, supplemented now and then by a risque CD-ROM, 79FF, proved more than sufficient. Michel knew that Bruno, by contrast, was frittering away his prime, chasing neurotic lolitas with big breasts, round buttocks, and eager mouths. Thank God he was a civil servant. It was not absurd, Bruno's world. It was a melodrama, where the characters were babes and dogs, cool guys and losers. Michel, on the other hand, lived in a world where everything was precisely regulated, a world without history, where all the seasons were commercial ones. The French Open, Christmas, New Year's Eve, the semi-annual arrival of the 3 Suisse catalogue. If he were homosexual, he would be able to take part in the AIDS walk or gay pride. If he were a libertine, he could look forward to the Salon de l'Érotisme. If he were a sportsman, he would be in the Pyrenees right now watching a leg in the Tour de France. Though an undiscriminating shopper, he was delighted when his local Monoprix had an Italian fortnight. This life was so well organized, on such a human scale. Happiness could be found in this. Had he wanted for more, he wouldn't have known where to find it. On the morning of 15th July, he took a Christian tract out of the trash can in the hall. It included several life stories, each converging toward an identical happy ending, an encounter with the risen Christ. For some time, he had followed the story of a young woman. Isabelle was in a state of shock. Her university career was on the line, though he had to admit that Pavel's experience was closer to his own. As an officer in the Czech army, commanding an anti-aircraft station was the pinnacle of Pavel's military career. He had no difficulty identifying with Pavel in the next paragraph. As a technical expert who had studied at a distinguished academy, Pavel should have been in love with life. Instead, he was depressed, constantly searching for a reason to live. The 3 Suisse catalogue, on the other hand, offered a more thoughtful, historically informed insight into Europe's current malaise. The impression of a coming mutation in society, in its opening pages, is finally given precise formulation on page 17. Michel considered for hours the lines that summed up the theme of the collection. Optimism, generosity, complicity, and harmony make the world go round. The future is female. On the 8 o'clock news, Bruno Massieu announced that an American study had detected signs of fossil life on Mars. The fossils were of bacterial organisms, probably methane-based archaea. It seemed that biological macromolecules had succeeded in forming on Earth's closest neighbor, giving rise to nebulous self-replicating life forms consisting of a nucleus and an ill-defined membrane. It had all ended there, however, presumably the result of climatic changes that made reproduction increasingly difficult to sustain until eventually it ceased entirely. The story of life on Mars was a modest one. However, and Bruno Masseur did not seem to understand this brief, feeble misfire brutally refuted all the mythological and religious constructs in which the human race delights. There had been no unique, wondrous act of creation, no chosen people, no chosen species or planet. Simply a series of tentative attempts, flawed for the most part, scattered across the universe. It was all so distressingly banal. The DNA of the Martian bacteria seemed identical to that of terrestrial bacteria. More than anything, this saddened him, in itself a sign of depression. In normal circumstances, a scientist, any scientist in good form, would be excited by the similarities and see in them the promise of a unifying synthesis. If DNA was everywhere the same, there must be reasons, profound reasons, linked to the molecular structure of peptides, or perhaps to the topological conditions of asexual reproduction. And it must be possible to discover these reasons. Had he been younger, such a prospect would have filled him with enthusiasm. When he first met Desplechin in 1982, Dzerzhinsky was finishing his doctoral thesis at the University of Ossé. As part of his studies, he took part in Alain Aspect's groundbreaking experiments, which showed that the behavior of photons emitted in succession from a single calcium atom was inseparable from the others. Michel was the youngest researcher on the team. Aspect's experiments, precise, rigorous, and perfectly documented, were to have profound repercussions in the scientific community. The results, it was acknowledged, were the first clear-cut refutation of Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen's objections when they claimed in 1935 that quantum theory is incomplete. Here was a clear violation of Bell's inequalities derived from Einstein's hypotheses, since the results tallied perfectly with quantum predictions. This meant that only two hypotheses were possible. Either the hidden properties which govern the behavior of subatomic particles were non-local, meaning they could instantaneously influence one another at an arbitrary distance, or else the very notion of particles having intrinsic properties in the absence of observation had to be abandoned. The latter opened up a deep ontological void, unless one adopted a radical positivism and contented oneself with developing a mathematical formalism which predicted the observable and gave up on any idea of an underlying reality. Naturally, it was this last option which won over the majority of researchers. The first paper on Aspect's experiments, Experimental Realization of Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen Gedanke Experiment, a new violation of Bell's inequalities, was published in issue 48 of the Physical Review. Dzerzhinsky was credited as co-writer of the article. A few days later, he had a visit from Desplechin. At 43, he was director of the Institute of Molecular Biology at Gif-sur-Yvette. He was increasingly aware that something fundamental was missing in their analysis of gene mutations, and that this was probably related to phenomena at the atomic level. Their first interview took place in Michel's dorm room. Desplechin was unsurprised by the dreary austerity of the surroundings. They were more or less what he expected. Their conversation continued late into the night. Desplechin pointed out that it was the existence of a finite list of chemical elements which had prompted Niels Bohr's first thoughts on the subject in the 1910s. A planetary theory of the atom based on gravitational and electromagnetic fields should, in principle, lead to an infinite number of solutions and an infinite number of possible chemical elements. The universe, however, was made up of about 100 elements, a list of which was fixed and stable. It was this situation, profoundly anomalous, according to Maxwell's equations and the classical laws of electromagnetics, that led to the development of quantum mechanics. In Desplechin's opinion, contemporary biology was now in a similar position. The existence of identical macromolecules and immutable cellular ultrastructures, which had remained consistent throughout evolutionary history, could not be explained by the laws of classical chemistry. In some way as yet impossible to determine, quantum theory must directly impact on biological events. This would create an entirely new field of research. That first evening, Desplechin was struck by his young interlocutor's calm open-mindedness. He invited Jarzynski to dinner at his home on the Rue de l'École Polytechnique the following Saturday, where one of his colleagues, a biochemist who had published extensively on RNA transcriptases, would join them. When he arrived at Desplechin's apartment, Michel felt as though he had walked onto a film set. Before this, he had scarcely imagined such a milieu. Leisure, cultivated with a refined and competent sense of taste. Walnut furniture, Spanish tile, kilims, Afghan rugs, reproductions of Matisse. Now he could imagine the rest. The house in Brittany, maybe a small farm in the Luberon, and a boxed set of Bartok quintets, I bet, he thought fleetingly as he began to eat. They had champagne with dinner. Dessert was a charlotte of red fruits, accompanied by an exceptional semi-dry rosé. It was at this point that Desplechin outlined his project. He could arrange for a post to be created in his department at GIF on a contractual basis. Michel would need to acquire the basic concepts of biochemistry to complement his studies, but that was easily done. Meanwhile, Desplechin would supervise his dissertation personally. Once that was completed, Michel could apply for a permanent post. Michel glanced at the small chimère statue on the mantelpiece, the clean lines of the figure of the Buddha touching the ground, asking nature to witness his resolve to reach enlightenment. Michel cleared his throat and accepted. In the decade that followed, remarkable technical advances and the use of radioactive markers made it possible to amass a substantial number of results. Though as far as the theoretical questions Desplechin had raised at their first meeting were concerned, thought Jarzynski, there had been zero progress. In the early hours of the morning, he found himself preoccupied with the Martian bacteria. He found a dozen messages on the internet, mostly from American universities. Proportions of adenine, guanine, thymine, and cytosine had been found to be typical. Randomly, he clicked on the Ann Arbor site, where he found a message about aging. Alicia Marcia Coelho had found evidence to suggest that DNA coding sequences were lost during the repeated subdivision of fibroblasts from non-striated muscles. This was hardly a surprise. Michel knew Alicia. In fact, it was she who had relieved him of his virginity 10 years before, after a particularly drunken dinner at a genetics seminar in Baltimore. She had been so drunk that she couldn't help him take off her bra. It had been a difficult moment, painful even. She had just split up with her husband, she confided, as Michel struggled with the clasps. After that, everything went normally. He was surprised to discover that he could get a hard-on and even ejaculate inside the researcher's vagina without feeling the slightest pleasure. Five. Many of the people who went to the lieu de changement were, like Bruno, over 40, and many, also like him, worked in the public sector or in education, and were safeguarded from poverty by their status as civil servants. Most of them would have put themselves on the political left. Most of them lived alone, usually as the result of divorce. He was, therefore, a pretty typical visitor. After a few days, he noticed that he felt somewhat less bad than usual. The women were intolerable at breakfast, but by cocktail hour, the mystical tarts were hopelessly vying with younger women once again. Death is the great leveler. On Wednesday afternoon, he met Catherine, a 50-year-old who had been a feminist of the old school. She was tanned with dark curly hair. She must have been very attractive when she was 20. Her breasts were still in good shape, he thought, when he saw her by the pool. But she had a fat ass. She had reinvented herself through Egyptian symbolism, tarot, and the like. She was talking about the god Anubis as Bruno lowered his boxer shorts. He decided she probably wouldn't be offended by his erection, and that they might become friends. Unfortunately, the erection didn't appear. She had rolls of fat between her thighs, which remained closed. They parted on less than friendly terms. That evening, just before dinner, a guy called Pierre-Louis introduced himself. He was a math teacher and looked the part. Bruno had noticed him a couple of days earlier at the theatrical evening. He had done a stand-up routine about a mathematical proof that went around in circles, some kind of comedy of the absurd, not the slightest bit funny. He scribbled furiously on a whiteboard. From time to time, he would stop abruptly, marker raised, motionless, bald head furrowed in thought, eyebrows raised in an expression that was supposed to be funny, before scribbling furiously and stammering more than ever. When the sketch ended, 5 or 6 people applauded, mostly out of pity. He blushed wildly. It was over. In the days that followed, Bruno had managed to avoid him on several occasions. He usually wore a sun hat. He was at least 6'4" and skinny, but he had a bit of a paunch and made a curious sight walking along the diving board with his fat little belly. He was probably about 45. That evening, Bruno again made a quick getaway while the beanpole joined the others in an improvised African dance. He walked up the hill toward the communal restaurant. There was a seat free beside the ex-feminist, who was sitting opposite a sister symbolist. He had barely started his tofu ragu when Pierre-Louis appeared at the far end of the row of tables. He beamed when he noticed a vacant chair opposite Bruno. He had been talking for some time before Bruno noticed, partly because he had a rather bad stammer, and partly because of the shrill nattering of the imbeciles next to them. What about the reincarnation of Osiris? What do you think of Egyptian marionettes? They were paying not the slightest attention to the men. At some point, Bruno realized that the poor fool was asking him about his job. Oh, nothing much, he replied vaguely. He was happy to talk about anything except the national curriculum. The meal was beginning to get on his nerves. He got up to go out for a cigarette. Unfortunately, at precisely that moment, the symbolists left, hips swinging, without so much as a glance in their direction. This probably is what triggered the incident. Bruno was about 10 meters from the table when he heard a loud whistle, or rather a strangled cry, high-pitched, almost inhuman. He turned around. Pierre-Louis was red-faced, his fists balled. From a standing start, he leapt onto the table with both feet. He took a deep breath, and the wheezing from his chest stopped. He started to pace up and down the table, thumping himself on the head with his fist as the glasses and plates danced around him. He kicked out at everything within reach, screaming, "You can't do this! You can't treat me like this!" For once he didn't stutter. It took 5 people to calm him down. He was admitted to the psychiatric ward of the hospital in Angoulême that evening. At 3 a.m., Bruno woke with a start and scrabbled his way out of the tent, soaked in sweat. The lieu was quiet, the moon was full, and the monotonous croak of tree frogs filled the air. He sat by the pond and waited for daybreak. Just before dawn, he felt a little cold. The morning sessions would start at 10 o'clock. At 10:15, he walked down to the pyramid. He hesitated outside the creative writing workshop, then went down to the next floor, where he studied the program for the watercolor class for about 20 seconds before walking up a couple of steps. The stairway was made of straight flights, each with a curved section in the middle. The steps grew wider toward the middle, and narrowed again as one approached the landing. In the curve was a step wider than all the others. It was here that Bruno sat, leaning against the wall. He began to feel well. As a schoolboy, he would often sit on a step between floors just after class began. These were his rare moments of happiness. Midway between landings, he would lean back against a wall, eyes half closed, sometimes wide open, and wait. Of course, someone might come, in which case he would have to get up, pick up his school bag, and walk quickly to his classroom, where class already had started. But often no one came. And here, on the grey-tiled steps, he wasn't in history class anymore. He wasn't in physics class yet. Everything was so peaceful. Then gently, almost furtively, his heart soared in short bursts toward joy. The circumstances were very different now. He had chosen to come to the lieu, chosen to take part in its activities. Upstairs was a creative writing class, just below the workshop on watercolor. Farther down, there would be classes on massage or holotropic breathing. Farther still, the African dance classes had clearly started up again. All around him, human beings were living, breathing, striving for pleasure, or trying to develop their personal potential. On every floor, human beings were improving, or trying to improve, their social, sexual, or professional skills, or find their place within the cosmos. They were bettering themselves, in the expression commonly used in the lieu. Bruno was beginning to feel a little sleepy. He had stopped wishing. He had stopped wanting. He was nowhere. Slowly, by degrees, his spirit filled to a state of nothingness. The sheer joy that comes of not being part of the world. For the first time since he was 13, Bruno was almost happy. Would you mind telling me where I might find the nearest candy shop? He went back to his tent and slept for 3 hours. When he awoke, he was in top form, and he had a hard-on. Sexual frustration in the human male manifests itself as a violent contraction in the lower abdomen, as the sperm seems to back up, and pangs shoot towards the chest. The penis itself is painful, constantly hot, and slightly sweaty. Bruno had not masturbated since Sunday, which probably had been a mistake. The last remaining myth of Western civilization was that sex was something to do, something expedient, a diversion. He put on a pair of swimming trunks and slipped some condoms into his bag, snorting with laughter as he did so. He had been carrying condoms around for years, and had never used one of them. After all, whores always had their own. The beach at Michel was crawling with jerk-offs in shorts and bimbos in thongs. This was reassuring. He bought an order of French fries and circulated among the vacationers before settling on a girl of about 20 with beautiful breasts, round, firm, and pert, with caramel-coloured nipples. "Hello," he said. He waited a beat. The girl frowned nervously. "Hello," he said again. "Would you mind telling me where I might find the nearest candy shop?" "Hmm?" she said, raising herself up on one elbow. It was then that he noticed she was wearing a Walkman. He backed off, pumping his arm by his side like Peter Falk in Columbo. There was no point in pushing it. It was all just too complicated, too second-rate. As he walked through the crowd toward the surf, he tried to keep an image of the girl's breasts in his mind. Suddenly, directly in front of him, 3 teenage girls stepped out of the waves. They couldn't be more than 14, he decided. He noticed their towels and spread his own on the sand a couple of meters away. They hadn't even noticed him. He quickly took off his t-shirt and draped it across his lap, rolled onto his side and took out his penis. With the precision of synchronized swimmers, the girls rolled down the tops of their swimsuits to get to the sun on their breasts. Before he had time to touch himself, Bruno came violently onto his t-shirt. He let out a moan and rolled over on the sand. It was done. The primitive rituals of happy hour. The high point of social life at the lieu de changement was over apéritif, which usually featured live music. That evening, there were 3 guys playing tom-toms to 50 or so guests who danced rooted to the spot and waved their arms in all directions. These were harvest dances, apparently, which some of them had been practicing in the African dance workshop. Customarily, after a number of hours, some of them would go into a trance, or pretend to. The archaic or literal sense of the word trance is extreme anxiety, fear at the idea of imminent danger. I would rather leave my home than go on living through such a trance. Émile Zola. Bruno offered the Catholic girl a glass of Pinot de Charente. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sophie," she replied. "Not dancing?" "No, I don't really like African dance. It's too..." Too what? He understood her dilemma. Too primitive? Certainly not. Too rhythmic? Even that bordered on racism. There was nothing you could say about African fucking dance. Poor Sophie was trying her best. Her face was pretty, pale-skinned with blue eyes framed by her dark hair. She had small breasts, but they were probably very sensitive. She had to be Breton. "Are you from Brittany?" he asked. "Yes, from Saint-Brieuc," she replied happily. "But I really like Brazilian dance," she added, obviously trying to absolve herself for her disinterest in African dance. Much more of this, and Bruno would really get irritated. He was starting to get pissed off about the world's stupid obsession with Brazil. What was so great about Brazil? As far as he knew, Brazil was a shithole full of morons obsessed with soccer and Formula One. It was the ne plus ultra of violence, corruption, and misery. If ever a country were loathsome, that country, specifically, was Brazil. "Sophie," announced Bruno, "I could go on vacation to Brazil tomorrow. I'd look around a favela. The minibus would be armor-plated. So in the morning, safe, unafraid, I'd go sightseeing. Check out 8-year-old murderers who dream of growing up to be gangsters. 13-year-old prostitutes dying of AIDS. I'd spend the afternoon at the beach surrounded by filthy rich drug barons and pimps. I'm sure that in such a passionate, not to mention liberal society, I could shake off the malaise of Western civilization. You're right, Sophie. I'll go straight to a travel agent as soon as I get home." Sophie considered him for a moment, her expression thoughtful, her brow lined with concern. Eventually, she said sadly, "You must have really suffered." "You know what Nietzsche said about Shakespeare, Sophie?" said Bruno. "The man must have suffered greatly to have such passion for playing the fool. Personally, I've always thought that Shakespeare was overrated, but now that I think about it, he is a big fool." He stopped and realized to his surprise that he really was beginning to suffer. Sometimes women were so compassionate. They met aggression with empathy, cynicism with tenderness. No man would do any such thing. "Sophie," he said with heartfelt emotion, "I'd like to lick your pussy." But she didn't hear him. She had turned away and struck up a conversation with the ski instructor, who had groped her ass 3 days earlier. Bruno stood speechless for a moment or two before crossing the lawn to the parking lot. The Leclerc supermarket at Royan was open until 10 o'clock. As he wandered through the aisles, he thought about Aristotle's claim that small women were of a different species. "A small man still seems to me to be a man," he wrote, "whereas a small woman appears to me to belong to a new type of animal." How could you square such a strange assertion with the habitual good sense of the Stagirite? Bruno bought a bottle of whiskey, a box of ravioli, and a pack of ginger snaps. By the time he got back, the lieu was dark. Passing the jacuzzi, he heard whispering and a muffled laugh. He stopped and peeked through the branches, plastic bag in hand. There were 2 or 3 couples. They were quiet now, the only sound the rippling of the water. The moon came out from behind the clouds. At that moment, another couple arrived and began to undress. The whispering began again. Bruno put the bag down, took out his penis, and started to masturbate. He ejaculated quickly, just as the woman slipped into the warm water. It was already Friday night. He was going to have to extend his stay by a week. He had to get a hold of himself, find a woman, talk to people. Six. On Friday night, Bruno slept badly and had a terrible dream. He was a piglet, his little body fat and sleek. With the other little piglets, he was sucked by a vortex into a vast, dark tunnel, its walls rusted and carried by the slow drift of the current. At times his feet touched the bottom, but then a powerful swell would carry him on. Sometimes he could make out the whitish flesh of one of his companions as it was brutally sucked down. They struggled through the darkness, and a silence broken only by the scraping of their hooves on the metal walls. As they plunged deeper, he could hear the dull sound of machines coming from the end of the tunnel. He began to realize that the vortex was pulling them toward turbines with huge, razor-sharp blades. Later, his severed head was lying in a meadow below the mouth of the drainpipe. His skull had been split from top to bottom, though what remained, lying on the grass, was still conscious. He knew that ants would slowly work their way into the exposed brain tissue to eat away at the neurons, and finally he would slip into unconsciousness. As he waited, he looked at the horizon through his one remaining eye. The grass seemed to stretch out forever. Huge cogwheels turned counterclockwise under a metallic sky. Perhaps this was the end of time. At least the world he'd known had ceased to exist. Over breakfast, he met the leader of the watercolor workshop, a veteran of 68 from Brittany. His name was Paul Dontec, one of the founding members of the lieu. His brother was the current director. He was the archetypal old hippie, long grey beard, Indian vest, and an ankh on a chain around his neck. At 55, this old wreck lived a peaceful life. He would get up at dawn to go bird watching in the hills, then sit down to a bowl of coffee and Calvados, and roll a cigarette amid the human bustle. The watercolor class didn't start until 10 o'clock. He had all the time in the world to chat. As a veteran of the lieu, said Bruno, laughing to establish a sense of complicity, however false, you must have a lot of stories about this place when it first opened. The 70s. Sexual liberation. Liberation my ass, groaned the geezer. There were always women who were wallflowers at orgies, and guys who just stood there waving their dicks. Take it from me, nothing much has changed. But I thought AIDS changed everything, said Bruno. I suppose it's true that it used to be easier for men, the watercolorist admitted, clearing his throat. You'd find a mouth or a pussy wide open, and you could dive right in, no standing on ceremony. But for that it had to be a proper orgy, invitation only. Usually, only couples. I tell you, I saw women with their legs wide open, wet and up for it, spending the whole evening masturbating because no one would fuck them. They couldn't even find someone to get them off. You had to be able to get it up first. So what you're saying, Bruno said thoughtfully, is that there never was real sexual liberation, just another form of seduction. Oh, yeah, the old fart agreed. There's always been a lot of seduction. This didn't exactly sound promising. Still, it was Saturday, so there would probably be a crop of newcomers. Bruno decided to chill out, take things as they came, go with the flow. As a result, his day passed without incident. In fact, without the slightest event. At about 11 o'clock that evening, he went down to the jacuzzi. A delicate haze rose above the gentle rumble of the water, lit by the full moon. He approached soundlessly. A couple were entwined on the far side of the pool. It looked as if she had mounted him like a horse. I have as much right as they have, thought Bruno furiously. He undressed quickly and slipped into the jacuzzi. The night air was cool, the water by contrast deliciously warm. Between the twisted branches of the pine trees he could see the stars and felt himself relax a little. The couple paid no attention to him. The girl continued to pump up and down on the guy, now starting to whimper. It was impossible to see her face. The man began to breathe heavily too. The woman's rhythm began to pick up tempo. She threw her head back, and for a moment the moon lit up her breasts, her face still hidden behind a dark mass of hair. Then she crushed herself against her partner and wrapped herself around him. His breathing was heavier now. Then he let out a long moan and was silent. They stayed there for a couple of minutes, wrapped around each other. Then the man stood up and got out of the pool. He unrolled the condom on his penis before dressing. Bruno was surprised to see that the woman was not leaving with him. The man's footsteps died away, and there was silence once more. She stretched out her legs in the water. Bruno did likewise. He felt her foot on his thigh, brushing against his penis. With a soft splash, she pushed herself from the edge and came to him. Clouds shadowed the moon. The woman was barely a half-meter away, but still he could not make out her face. He felt an arm against his thigh, and another wrap around his shoulder. Bruno pressed his body to hers, his face against her small, firm breasts. He let go of the edge and gave himself up to her embrace. He could feel her drawing him toward the center of the pool. Then slowly she began to turn. He felt the muscles in his neck give, his head suddenly heavy. Below the surface, the gentle murmur of the water became a thunderous roar. He saw the stars as they wheeled slowly overhead. He relaxed into her arms, and his erect penis broke the surface of the water. She moved her hands gently, barely a caress. He was completely weightless. Her long hair brushed his stomach, and then her tongue touched the tip of his glans. His whole body shuddered with happiness. She closed her lips and slowly, so slowly, took him in her mouth. He closed his eyes, his body shuddering in ecstasy. The underwater roar was infinitely reassuring. When he felt her lips at the base of his penis, he could feel the movement of her throat. He felt himself flooded with intense waves of pleasure and buoyed up by the whirlpool. All at once he was very hot. She gently allowed her throat to contract around him. All the energy in his being rushed suddenly to his penis. He howled as he came. He had never felt such fulfillment in his life.